She changed. Her energy shifted. Her tone feels different. She's not cold, but she's not the same. And you start asking yourself, is there someone else? Today, we're going to talk about something most men feel, but rarely understand. How women act when there's another man in the picture. Not drama, not guessing, just behavior patterns. And by the end of this video, you'll see the signs clearly. Comment, no more games. Number 1. Her energy changes. Her energy changes and you feel it immediately before you understand it, because attraction always shows up in behavior long before it shows up in words. And you are sitting there pretending everything is normal while your intuition keeps whispering that something is different. The replies are slower, the tone is flatter, the enthusiasm is reduced, the way she looks at you lacks intensity, and you are trying to convince yourself you are overthinking, when in reality you are observing a shift in emotional investment. And the mistake most people make in this moment is reacting emotionally instead of strategically. Because when her energy decreases, your instinct is to increase yours. You text more, you ask more questions, you offer more reassurance, you try to be funnier, more available, more accommodating. But what you are actually communicating is fear of loss, and fear lowers perceived value every single time. And if you are honest with yourself, you know exactly when this begins, because there is a moment where you sense she is no longer fully present. She laughs, but not deeply. She listens, but not attentively. She says she is busy more often, and you start replaying interactions in your head at night, wondering what you did wrong. But this is where discipline begins, because instead of asking what you did wrong, you ask what you are neglecting in your own life that makes her emotional shift feel like a threat to your identity. Because if your entire emotional stability depends on her consistency, then you have already outsourced your strength. And Stoic discipline means you do not control her behavior, but you absolutely control your response. And that response determines whether you rise or spiral. So in this moment, you stop chasing and you start observing. You reduce unnecessary communication. You stop over-explaining. You give space without announcing it dramatically, and you redirect your energy into structured self-improvement. You wake up earlier, you train your body harder, you tighten your schedule, you eliminate distractions, you focus on measurable goals, because attraction respects momentum, and momentum requires direction. And if she senses that your world does not revolve around her validation, she either recalibrates or drifts further. And both outcomes give you clarity, and clarity is more valuable than comfort. And imagine this scenario unfolding in real time. She cancels plans last minute, claiming exhaustion. Instead of negotiating for another time that same evening, you respond calmly that you understand, and you return to your priorities without emotional pressure. And suddenly, the dynamic shifts, because you are no longer performing for approval. You are living according to your standards. And standards are what separate emotional dependence from grounded strength. And when her energy shifts, you do not interrogate her. You evaluate the situation. You ask yourself whether you have become predictable, complacent, overly available. Have you stopped progressing physically, financially, intellectually? Have you lost edge in your ambition because stagnation is unattractive and improvement is compelling? And this is not about blaming yourself for her choices, but about recognizing that you always have leverage over your own growth. And growth restores confidence, and confidence changes posture, tone, eye contact, decisiveness, and those subtle changes alter how people perceive you. And if there is another man in the background giving novelty and attention, the only sustainable response is not competition, but elevation, because competition focuses on him, while elevation focuses on you. And when you elevate consistently, you stop obsessing over her emotional fluctuations, because your identity becomes anchored in progress rather than approval. And that anchoring is the application of Stoic strength in daily life, where you accept what you cannot control and master what you can. And you do this not to manipulate her, but to fortify yourself, and when she senses that her reduced energy does not destabilize you. She begins to reassess her position because people test boundaries consciously or unconsciously, and when they encounter calm strength instead of reactive anxiety, the test loses power. And if she continues drifting, you remain composed because your life is expanding regardless, and that composure becomes your advantage in every area beyond relationships, in business, in friendships, in health, because you train yourself to respond rather than react. And this is the turning point where pain becomes fuel, where uncertainty becomes clarity, where emotional discomfort becomes discipline, and you realize that her changing energy is not a signal to collapse, but an invitation to level up. And you sit down tonight and write down exactly what you have been postponing, the physique you want, the income target you have delayed, the skills you have avoided building, and you break each into daily actions that require effort, whether you feel motivated or not, because consistency is power, and power removes fear of replacement, and when you remove fear, you become stable, and stability is attractive, not because it is loud, but because it is reliable. And when you are reliable within yourself, you stop seeking reassurance externally, and suddenly her emotional shifts do not dictate your mood. And that emotional independence transforms the entire dynamic, because now you are not reacting to her energy. You are setting the tone of your own life, and whether she realigns or exits becomes secondary to who you are becoming. And that is how you turn a painful realization into personal expansion, by choosing discipline over desperation, observation over accusation, self-respect over chasing. And when you embody this fully, you understand that her energy changing is not the end of your value, but the beginning of your awakening. And if this awakening is happening inside you right now, if you are realizing that her shifting energy is exposing the gaps in your discipline, your direction, and your standards, then the Stoic Relationship Blueprint ebook for men is built exactly for this moment, filled with timeless principles that train you to control your reactions, strengthen your identity, and operate from grounded authority no matter what changes around you. It is now available in audiobook format, so you can absorb this life-shaping knowledge while walking alone with your thoughts, while training your body, while driving, while building the future you know you are capable of creating. Ask yourself honestly, how different would your life look if you never reacted from insecurity again, if you never chased validation again, if you never doubted your value when someone's attention shifted? This is not temporary motivation, it is a permanent framework you own forever, meaning once you have it, the principles are yours for life, and you can return to them whenever you need clarity and strength. It is linked in the comments, and if you are serious about transforming rather than repeating cycles, this is the next decisive step. Number 2. She guards her phone. Her phone behavior shifts, and you notice it immediately, because patterns never lie. The device that once sat casually on the table now stays face down. Notifications that used to light up freely are now angled away from your sight. The screen locks faster when you walk into the room, and you tell yourself you are imagining it while your instincts keep signaling that something changed. And instead of admitting that the change unsettles you, you begin monitoring, analyzing, watching every movement. And that internal spiral slowly erodes your composure, because now your emotional state depends on a rectangle in her hand. And this is where most people lose control, not because of what is on the phone, but because of what it represents, which is divided attention, secrecy, and the possibility that you are no longer the primary focus. And when you feel that possibility, your ego reacts. You want answers, reassurance, access. But asking for access from a position of anxiety lowers your authority instantly, because it communicates fear of replacement, and fear shifts the balance of power. And if you are honest with yourself, the real discomfort is not the device itself, but the realization that you may have allowed your entire sense of security to depend on someone else's transparency. And Stoic strength begins exactly here, in the moment where your emotions push you to react, but you choose discipline instead, because you cannot control what is on that screen, but you can control whether you become unstable in response to it. And instability is what destroys leverage. So instead of interrogating, you observe, you measure consistency over time, you evaluate behavior as data rather than drama, and you ask yourself difficult questions that most avoid. Have you built a life so focused and structured that losing one person would not collapse your identity? Or have you centered your world around her validation to the point where every hidden notification feels like a threat to your existence? And that introspection is uncomfortable but necessary, because growth requires confrontation with truth. And the truth is that when someone guards their phone excessively, it signals either privacy boundaries or emotional investment elsewhere. And your response determines whether you rise or shrink, because reacting with jealousy teaches her that you are easily destabilized, while responding with calm detachment communicates that your value does not depend on access to her device. And detachment is not indifference. It is self-control in action. It is the decision to prioritize dignity over desperation. And imagine this happening in real time. She angles her screen away while smiling at a message. Instead of asking who it is with tension in your voice, you maintain composure and continue your activity. And later, in a neutral tone, you state your standard clearly, that you do not compete for divided attention and you expect mutual respect. And then you return to your priorities without over-explaining. And that single act of calm boundary setting shifts the dynamic, because you demonstrate that you are aware but not reactive. And awareness combined with restraint builds authority, and authority increases respect, and respect sustains attraction more effectively than control ever will. And while you hold that boundary, you simultaneously strengthen yourself in tangible ways. You tighten your schedule, you commit to physical training consistently, you reduce idle time that feeds overthinking, you invest in skills that increase income, you expand your social network so your world grows beyond one person's availability, because when your life expands, the phone loses its emotional power over you. And once you remove emotional dependency, you see the situation clearly. Either she aligns with your standards or she continues guarding what she values more. And both outcomes provide clarity. And clarity is liberation, because it prevents you from living in constant suspicion. And suspicion without action drains energy that could be used to elevate your life. And you realize that the most powerful position is not gaining access to her messages, but mastering your reactions. Because the person who controls himself cannot be manipulated by uncertainty, and that mastery requires daily practice. When anxiety rises, you breathe and delay response. When jealousy surfaces, you redirect into productive action. When curiosity tempts you to check or demand, you choose patience. And over time, this discipline builds internal stability that no external behavior can shake. And this stability transforms not only this relationship dynamic, but every interaction you have in life, because you train yourself to respond with thought rather than impulse. And when she senses that her guarded behavior does not provoke panic, she begins to reassess whether secrecy holds the same power, and sometimes that awareness causes transparency to return, and sometimes it reveals incompatibility. But either way, you gain strength, and strength makes you independent of outcomes. And independence creates confidence that is felt in posture, tone, eye contact, and decision-making. And that presence influences how others treat you beyond romantic contexts, in professional settings, in friendships, in opportunities, because you operate from grounded composure rather than emotional volatility. And if there is someone else in the background, the most effective response is not to compete digitally, but to elevate personally, because you cannot outperform someone in private messages, but you can outgrow insecurity through discipline. And when you outgrow insecurity, you stop fearing comparison. And that absence of fear changes everything. And the moment you internalize that your worth is not measured by someone else's phone transparency, you reclaim your power. And from that position, you can calmly decide whether this relationship aligns with your standards. And if it does not, you have the strength to walk away without resentment, because you know you are building a life so structured and meaningful that no hidden notification can threaten your identity. and that realization transforms a painful suspicion into a catalyst for self-development. And you begin tonight by writing down the habits that reinforce emotional dependence and systematically replacing them with actions that reinforce independence. And you commit to consistency over emotion, because consistency builds confidence, and confidence dissolves fear. And once fear dissolves, you operate from clarity. And clarity ensures that regardless of what is on that screen, you remain steady, focused, and in control of your direction. Number 3. She compares you. Comparison begins subtly, and you feel the shift before you fully process it, because the tone changes when she says certain things. She starts referencing what other people do, how some guys plan better, earn more, communicate differently, dress sharper, lead stronger. And at first you brush it off as casual conversation, but over time the pattern forms, and you recognize that you are being measured against an invisible standard that was not present before. And that realization unsettles you, because it activates a quiet fear that you are being evaluated in real time. And most people respond to this evaluation with defensiveness. They explain, justify, argue, attempt to prove themselves worthy. But defensiveness signals insecurity, and insecurity lowers perceived strength. And when you react emotionally to comparison, you validate the frame that you are competing for approval rather than operating from grounded self-worth. And this is where discipline separates reactive behavior from controlled presence. Because instead of arguing against the comparison, you step back and analyze what is actually happening. Comparison reveals that her attention is exploring alternatives, whether physically present or mentally imagined. And exploration happens when certainty declines, and certainty declines when attraction weakens or novelty appears elsewhere. And that truth is uncomfortable but powerful, because once you accept it, you stop trying to win debates and start focusing on elevating your position in life. And elevation does not mean performing to impress her. It means strengthening yourself in measurable ways that do not depend on validation. And you ask yourself difficult questions that cut deeper than any comparison she makes. Are you progressing physically, or have you grown complacent? Are you building financially, or have you stalled? Are you expanding your knowledge or staying stagnant? Are you decisive in your actions or drifting without direction? And these questions sting because they require ownership. But ownership creates power, and power restores composure. And imagine this moment unfolding. She says another man is more ambitious or more spontaneous or more attentive. Instead of challenging her statement, you respond calmly that she is free to choose what aligns with her standards. And then you return your focus to your goals without dramatizing the interaction. And that calm response communicates that you are not threatened by external comparisons, because your value is not determined by her temporary evaluation. And that steadiness shifts the dynamic, because people test boundaries when they sense emotional leverage, and when they find none, the test loses effect. And this is not about suppressing emotion, but mastering it, because mastery requires you to pause, assess, and act according to principle rather than impulse. And in that pause, you recognize that comparison only destabilizes you if you secretly doubt yourself. And if doubt exists, the solution is not arguing but improving, and improvement is practical. You establish a structured training routine and commit to it regardless of mood. You refine your wardrobe to reflect intentionality. You strengthen communication by practicing direct speech and controlled tone. You build competence in your career through focused skill development. You set quarterly goals with clear deadlines and track progress weekly. And as these habits compound, your internal confidence rises naturally, because it is built on evidence rather than reassurance. And once confidence is rooted in progress, you stop fearing comparison because you know you are advancing consistently. And when you know you are advancing, you no longer need to defend yourself verbally. Your life trajectory speaks louder than arguments, and at this point you begin to see comparison for what it truly is, a signal of shifting dynamics rather than a personal attack. And you use that signal as feedback to refine yourself rather than collapse, and that refinement strengthens you beyond this relationship. It sharpens your discipline. enhances your focus, deepens your resilience, and these traits improve every domain of your existence. And as you continue growing, the comparison either fades because she recognizes your upward trajectory, or it intensifies because her interests lie elsewhere. And both outcomes provide clarity, and clarity frees you from living in emotional uncertainty, and once free, you operate from grounded independence. And independence alters posture, eye contact, pacing, decision-making, and that presence influences how others perceive and treat you. And you realize that comparison only wounds when you lack self-direction, and self-direction is cultivated daily through consistent action aligned with long-term vision, and vision requires you to define the kind of person you intend to become, regardless of who stays or leaves, and you sit down and write that vision in detail: the body you aim to build, the income you aim to reach, the character traits you aim to embody, the standards you refuse to compromise, and you convert that vision into daily habits that demand effort, and effort builds pride, and pride grounded in achievement cannot be shaken by passing remarks. And over time you notice something profound. When you stop reacting to comparison and start embodying discipline, your emotional stability increases, and stability commands respect more effectively than reactive persuasion. And whether she recalibrates or continues exploring alternatives becomes secondary to the transformation occurring within you, because you are no longer trapped in proving yourself. You are invested in becoming undeniable through consistent growth, and that transformation reshapes your identity, because now you see comparison not as humiliation, but as motivation, not as rejection, but as redirection towards self-mastery. And that mastery ensures that no external evaluation defines your worth, because your worth is anchored in action, and action aligned with principle creates a life so structured and purposeful that comparison loses its emotional grip. And once that grip dissolves, you operate from calm strength, and calm strength changes everything. Number 4. She pulls away physically. Physical distance begins subtly, and it reveals more than words ever will, because attraction expresses itself through proximity, through touch, through sustained eye contact, through unforced engagement. And when that proximity decreases, you notice the space widening between you on the couch, the reduced initiation of affection, the shorter embraces, the distracted posture. And instead of confronting the shift with grounded observation, most people respond by closing that space aggressively, leaning in harder, asking for reassurance, increasing attempts at intimacy, trying to recover what is fading through pressure. But pressure suffocates desire, and desperation dissolves respect. And if you examine your reaction closely, you recognize that the discomfort is not just about reduced affection, but about perceived loss of position, because physical closeness once confirmed your importance, and now its absence triggers insecurity. And insecurity seeks immediate relief through validation. But validation requested under pressure weakens authority, and authority influences attraction more deeply than pleading ever will. And this is where discipline enters, because instead of chasing closeness, you choose composure. You reduce emotional volatility. You resist the urge to demand explanations, and you step back internally to evaluate the broader dynamic, asking yourself whether you have allowed familiarity to erode mystery, whether predictability replaced progression, whether your ambition has slowed, whether your body reflects neglect rather than strength, whether your communication lost decisiveness. And these questions are uncomfortable because they require ownership rather than blame. But ownership grants power, and power restores stability. And imagine the scenario unfolding in real time. She leans away slightly during conversation. Instead of adjusting closer and forcing engagement, you maintain your posture. You continue speaking calmly. You conclude the interaction without tension, and you redirect your attention to your mission without dramatizing the moment. And that response communicates that your identity does not collapse because of temporary distance. And stability under uncertainty commands respect because it signals self-sufficiency, and self-sufficiency increases perceived value. And while you hold that composure, you simultaneously elevate yourself in tangible ways. You strengthen your physical condition through disciplined training. You refine your appearance through intentional grooming and style. You sharpen your mental clarity through focused learning. You build your financial foundation through skill acquisition and structured effort, and these upgrades compound over time, shifting your internal confidence from fragile to grounded. And once grounded, you stop measuring your worth by the frequency of her touch. And when you stop measuring your worth externally, you reclaim emotional independence, and emotional independence transforms the dynamic, because now you are not attempting to extract validation, but offering presence without attachment. And attachment without self-control breeds neediness, while presence anchored in discipline fosters intrigue, and intrigue sustains attraction more effectively than pursuit. And if her distance is rooted in divided attention, your stability exposes the contrast between anxious reaction and calm authority, and that contrast influences perception because people reassess their position when they encounter unwavering composure instead of insecurity. And sometimes that reassessment draws them back, and sometimes it accelerates separation. But either outcome serves growth because you are strengthening traits that elevate every domain of your life: resilience, focus, restraint, decisiveness, and those traits extend beyond relationships into career advancement, leadership presence, social influence, and personal fulfillment. And as you internalize these habits, you recognize that physical withdrawal is not merely a relational issue, but a catalyst for introspection, pushing you to confront areas of stagnation you previously ignored. And rather than resenting the situation, you leverage it to refine your standards. You define what mutual engagement looks like. You clarify boundaries regarding effort and reciprocity, and you communicate those boundaries without aggression, stating calmly that you value connection, but you do not beg for it, and that clarity filters compatibility efficiently. And if she aligns with your standards, the dynamic stabilizes. And if she continues withdrawing, you gain confirmation that alignment no longer exists, and confirmation prevents prolonged confusion, and confusion drains energy that could fuel ambition, and ambition directed consistently builds momentum, and momentum reinforces self-trust, and self-trust reduces anxiety about replacement. And once anxiety diminishes, your posture changes, your tone steadies, your decisions become sharper, and that transformation shifts how others respond to you across contexts. And you begin to understand that physical distance tests emotional discipline, and emotional discipline strengthens character, and character influences long-term outcomes far more than temporary closeness. And by applying restraint, focusing on improvement, and maintaining composure, you convert discomfort into development, and development solidifies identity independent of external affection, and identity anchored in principle cannot be destabilized by fluctuating behavior, and that realization liberates you from reactive cycles, enabling you to move through relationships with clarity, strength, and unwavering direction. Number 5. She starts defending someone. The shift becomes undeniable when you mention a name and her tone changes, when a simple reference to another person triggers explanation, justification, or irritation, and you recognize that the reaction is disproportionate to the situation because neutrality does not require defense, and defense signals value, and value indicates emotional investment, whether acknowledged or not. And in that moment, most people react impulsively. They interrogate, accuse, escalate, demand clarity, but escalation exposes insecurity, and insecurity weakens leverage. And if you observe carefully, you understand that her defensiveness is not random but protective, because people instinctively shield what holds significance. And your challenge is not to expose her, but to master yourself, because the real test occurs within you. Your ego flares, your pride tightens, your mind starts constructing scenarios, yet discipline requires you to pause, assess, and respond with composure rather than confrontation. And that pause separates reaction from authority, and authority influences respect more effectively than anger. And imagine the interaction unfolding. You mention a colleague or acquaintance, and she responds sharply. Instead of countering with accusations, you state calmly that you respect freedom of choice, but you do not compete for divided attention, and then you disengage from the emotional charge without hostility, and that restraint communicates self-assurance because it demonstrates that your worth is not dependent on being defended or prioritized in every conversation. And this is where introspection deepens, because you ask yourself why her defense unsettles you so strongly. Is it fear of replacement, fear of inadequacy, fear of losing status? And by identifying the root, you gain control over it, because unexamined fear drives impulsive behavior, while examined fear loses intensity. And once intensity decreases, you can act strategically. And strategic action involves strengthening every dimension of your life so thoroughly that competition becomes irrelevant. You refine your physical discipline through consistent training. You sharpen your financial trajectory by acquiring skills that increase earning capacity. You expand your social presence by cultivating networks that reflect growth and ambition. You invest in intellectual development to deepen perspective and communication clarity. And these upgrades shift your internal confidence from fragile to grounded. And grounded confidence reduces jealousy because it rests on evidence of progress rather than reassurance from others. And when you operate from grounded confidence, you stop arguing over emotional defenses and instead evaluate compatibility through standards. You define clearly what loyalty, respect, and reciprocity look like to you, and you communicate those standards calmly without threat. And if alignment exists, the dynamic stabilizes. And if misalignment persists, you accept reality without clinging. And acceptance does not mean passivity, but clarity, because clarity prevents prolonged emotional confusion, and confusion drains focus that could fuel advancement. And advancement strengthens identity, and identity anchored in discipline remains steady regardless of external fluctuations. And as you internalize this approach, you notice a shift within yourself. You no longer obsess over who she defends. You observe behavior patterns objectively. You track consistency over time, rather than reacting to isolated incidents. And you recognize that repeated defensive reactions reveal priorities, and priorities inform decisions, and decisions determine outcomes. And by evaluating patterns rather than chasing reassurance, you reclaim agency. And agency empowers you to choose environments that align with your values instead of negotiating for attention. And this transformation extends beyond the relationship context, because you begin applying the same principle in career and personal growth. You detach from external validation. You focus on measurable improvement. You build routines that reinforce stability, and stability commands respect across interactions. And respect strengthens influence, and influence expands opportunities. And through this disciplined process, you convert a potentially destabilizing situation into a catalyst for self-elevation. And elevation shifts perception not only externally but internally, because you begin to see yourself as capable of maintaining composure under pressure, and that self-perception fuels further growth, and growth compounds over months and years into a life structured around purpose rather than reaction. And when you reach that state, the defensive reactions of others lose emotional control over you, because your sense of value no longer depends on their words or tone, and at that point, you evaluate relationships from abundance rather than scarcity, and abundance removes desperation, and absence of desperation enhances presence, and presence grounded in self-mastery becomes compelling, and regardless of whether she recalibrates or distances further, you remain aligned with your standards, and alignment produces peace, rooted in discipline, rather than comfort rooted in dependency, and that peace enables clear decision-making, and clear decisions protect your time and energy, and protected energy fuels ambition. And ambition expressed through consistent action transforms not only this situation, but your entire trajectory, because you recognize that the greatest leverage you possess is control over your own behavior. And by mastering that control, you ensure that no external defense, no redirected loyalty, no emotional shift can destabilize your foundation. And that foundation becomes the platform from which you build a life defined by purpose, clarity, and unwavering direction. If this message hits something deep inside you, if you are tired of confusion, tired of chasing, tired of learning lessons the hard way while society feeds you comfort instead of strength, then understand this is your turning point. And the Stoic relationship, Blueprint ebook for men, exists for exactly this moment, packed with timeless Stoic principles that sharpen your mind, harden your discipline, and transform your life from the inside out. It is now available in audiobook form, so you can absorb this life-changing knowledge while walking alone, training, driving, building your future, turning idle time into power. This is the kind of clarity most people never receive because growth threatens mediocrity. And once you own this book, the principles are yours forever, a permanent weapon against weakness and regret, and it is linked in the comments waiting for you. If you are ready to stop repeating cycles and start operating with strength, comment "No more chasing" below so you declare it publicly. Like this video and subscribe so more people find these truths before they waste years learning them through pain.